late 18th century, two worlds faced each other across oceans of distance and belief. One believed wealth should flow freely, guided by power and profit. The other believed harmony came from order, tradition, and control. Between them lay tea, silver, and a growing hunger that would not be satisfied. What began as trade slowly transformed into obsession and then into coercion. When balance failed, morality bent. A drug crossed borders, not by accident, but by design. This is the story of how commerce became a weapon, how addiction became policy, and how an ancient civilization was pushed toward collapse in the name of trade. They came by the thousands, pulled from villages and farms, their lives measured not in years, but in quotas of labor and duty. Long before cannons fired and treaties were signed, the foundations of empire were laid through forced effort and human exhaustion. Across the world, Britain's factories roared with energy, while its people developed an unquenchable thirst for Chinese tea. Every cup poured in London carried with it an invisible cost, one paid not in leaves, but in silver. By the late 18th century, tea had become a necessity of British life. It was consumed by the rich and the poor alike, woven into daily routine and national identity. China, however, wanted nothing Britain produced. Its economy was self-sufficient, its confidence ancient. The Qing Empire allowed foreign trade only through the port of Canton, under strict rules. Tea flowed outward, silver flowed inward. For China, this arrangement maintained stability. For Britain, it became a slow economic bleed. The silver drain alarmed the British East India Company and the government that supported it. Year after year, wealth left Britain and settled in Chinese vaults. Diplomacy failed. British envoys, including the famous Macartney Mission of 1793, attempted to open China to wider trade. They were politely dismissed. To the Qing court, Britain was just another distant kingdom, not an equal power demanding concessions. This rejection planted the seeds of resentment. Britain, now industrialized and expanding, could not accept permanent imbalance. An empire built on growth could not tolerate economic submission. Somewhere between frustration and entitlement, a dangerous idea took root. If China would not buy British goods, it would be made to buy something else. That something was opium. Grown in vast quantities in British-controlled India, opium had long been known in China as a limited medicinal substance. But what Britain introduced was different, refined, concentrated, and distributed on a massive scale. Though illegal under Chinese law, opium flooded the southern coast through smugglers protected by British merchants and warships. It was not sold openly, but its presence was unmistakable. Addiction spread silently at first, then violently. Silver began flowing back, out of China this time, carried away by foreign traders in exchange for the drug. The balance shifted. Britain celebrated what it called corrected trade. China saw something else entirely. Social decay, economic destabilization, and a crisis of authority. Families were ruined. Soldiers grew weak. Officials took bribes. The drug hollowed society from within. The Qing government tried to stop it. Laws were enforced. Arrests were made. Opium was seized and destroyed. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu took decisive action in Canton, confiscating and publicly destroying over 20,000 chests of opium. To China, this was an act of justice and sovereignty. To Britain, it was an unforgivable insult. The language of trade shifted. What had once been smuggling was now called free commerce. What had been addiction was reframed as market demand. Britain declared that its honor, its property, and its right to trade had been violated. Warships were dispatched. Diplomacy gave way to force. By the eve of war, the transformation was complete. Trade was no longer an exchange between equals. It had become a test of power. China stood on the edge of catastrophe, facing an empire that had decided profit outweighed law and coercion outweighed consent. The drug had done its work, the balance was shattered, and the world was about to change forever. When British warships appeared along the Chinese coast, they carried more than cannons and flags. They carried a new definition of power. Steam-driven vessels, iron-hulled and armed with modern artillery, moved effortlessly against wind and tide. To the Qing Empire, whose defenses were designed for an earlier age, this was not simply a military challenge, it was a revelation of vulnerability. The First Opium War did not begin with grand declarations. It unfolded through skirmishes, blockades, and demonstrations of force meant to intimidate rather than negotiate. British commanders understood that China's strength lay not in its navy, but in its size, its population, and its long memory of order. To win, they did not need to conquer the land. They only needed to break its confidence. Chinese coastal forts fell quickly. Cannons that had guarded harbors for generations proved useless against ships that could fire from beyond their range. British forces sailed up rivers once thought impassable, threatening cities that had never seen foreign soldiers. Each defeat sent shockwaves inland, spreading fear faster than any army could march. The Qing court struggled to understand what it faced. For centuries, China had dealt with threats through diplomacy, tribute, or containment. This enemy did not seek assimilation or alliance. It demanded submission to an idea, free trade enforced by gunfire. The concept itself was foreign, almost impossible to grasp. How could the sale of a poison be defended as a moral right? Internal divisions paralyzed decision-making. Some officials urged resistance at all costs, invoking sovereignty and law. Others, terrified by Britain's technological superiority, pushed for negotiation. Meanwhile, the emperor remained distant from the battlefield, relying on reports that softened defeats and exaggerated victories. Reality arrived too late. As British forces advanced, the human cost mounted. Civilians fled coastal towns, trade collapsed, famine followed disruption. Yet Britain framed its campaign not as conquest, but as correction, a limited war to secure fair treatment. In Parliament, the morality of opium was debated, but profit and prestige carried greater weight. Empire, once committed, rarely retreats. By 1841, British ships controlled key ports. The Qing government, exhausted and humiliated, sought peace. What followed was not a negotiation between equals, but a settlement dictated by force. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, ended the war, but it did not end the conflict. China was compelled to open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade and residents. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. Massive indemnities were imposed, draining China's treasury. Most devastating of all, the treaty dismantled China's control over its own commerce. Tariffs were fixed by foreigners. Sovereignty was fractured. Though opium itself was not explicitly legalized in the treaty, its trade was effectively protected. British merchants returned stronger than before, backed by legal immunity and military threat. What China had tried to eradicate was now entrenched. The war's meaning extended far beyond its battles. For Britain, it marked the triumph of industrial power and global reach. For China, it marked the beginning of a long descent, a realization that ancient strength was no defense against modern force. The illusion of invincibility shattered. This was not just defeat, it was exposure. China stood revealed in a new world order, where tradition could be overridden by technology, and morality could be silenced by cannons. The war fought over a drug had ended, but the damage it unleashed was only beginning. The Treaty of Nanking didn't bring peace to China. It brought a pause, a fragile, bitter silence in which the empire struggled to understand what it had lost. Foreign flags now flew over treaty ports. Foreign laws governed foreign merchants. The Qing Dynasty still ruled in name, but its authority had been pierced, and everyone knew it. Opium flowed more freely than ever. With British protection, The trade expanded inland, reaching villages and cities once untouched. Addiction spread across all levels of society. Farmers sold land to feed their dependents. Officials accepted bribes to ignore the laws they no longer had the power to enforce. The social fabric frayed under the weight of dependency and despair. Foreign powers followed Britain's example. France, the United States, and others demanded their own treaties, ports, and privileges. China became a marketplace carved into zones of influence. Each concession weakened the state further, eroding confidence in the Qing court's ability to protect its people. Resentment grew, not just toward foreigners, but toward a ruling system that seemed incapable of resistance. The imbalance ignited internal rebellion. The most devastating was the Taiping Rebellion, beginning in 1850. Fueled by social collapse, economic strain, and spiritual crisis, it consumed vast regions of China. Tens of millions died. While foreign powers watched and intervened selectively, China bled itself from within. The empire that had once seen itself as eternal now struggled simply to survive. Yet even in chaos, the lesson of the Opium War was clear. China's defeat had not been cultural or moral, it had been technological. Reformers within the empire called for modernization, new weapons, new schools, new industries. The self-strengthening movement was born, an attempt to adopt Western tools without surrendering Chinese identity. But reform was uneven, resisted by conservatives who feared change more than decline. A second Opium War erupted in the 1850s, deepening humiliation. Foreign troops marched into Beijing. The Summer Palace, a symbol of imperial elegance, was looted and burned. The act was not just destruction, it was a message. China's past could be erased as easily as its laws ignored. By the late 19th century, the Qing Dynasty was hollow. Railways and factories appeared, but they were controlled by foreigners. Ports buzzed with trade, but profits flowed outward. China remained vast, but it was no longer sovereign in practice. Each treaty, each concession, reminded the population of a truth too painful to forget. This era came to be known as the Century of Humiliation. It was not defined by a single defeat, but by the slow accumulation of losses, territory, dignity, control. And at its origin stood a war justified by trade and fought over a drug. The opium pipe became a symbol of something larger, a nation forced into submission not by conquest alone, but by dependence. China remembered. Even as it stumbled, the memory burned. History had shifted. The old world was gone, and a reckoning was quietly taking shape. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Qing dynasty was reaching its final breath. The empire that had endured for centuries collapsed under the weight of internal decay and external pressure. In 1911, the last emperor abdicated, ending imperial rule in China. But the fall of the dynasty did not close the story that began with opium. It carried it forward, embedding its lessons deep into national memory. For China, the Opium Wars became more than historical events. They became symbols, warnings carved into the collective consciousness. They represented the moment when sovereignty was stripped away, when law was overridden by force, and when weakness invited domination. Every later struggle, from revolution to reform, carried the shadow of that humiliation. Modern Chinese nationalism was shaped by this memory. Leaders across generations promised the same thing. Never again. Never again would China allow foreign powers to dictate its trade. Never again would addiction be used as a weapon. Never again would the nation be forced open by gunboats. The past was not forgotten. It was preserved as instruction. The global legacy of the Opium War reached far beyond China. It marked a turning point in world history, when economic power and military force fused into a single instrument. Trade was no longer neutral. It could be imposed. Markets could be opened by violence. Moral justifications could be written after profits were secured. this logic did not end with empires. It echoed through the 20th century and into the present. Economic sanctions, unequal agreements, resource exploitation, and corporate influence all trace part of their lineage to this moment. The language is softer now. The mechanisms are more complex, but the imbalance of power remains a familiar pattern. The drug itself faded from global politics, but addiction did not. The lesson that suffering could be monetized survived. Modern societies, too, struggle with substances sold legally despite their harm, justified by markets and demand. The past speaks quietly, but it speaks clearly. Britain, once triumphant, eventually lost its empire. The global order shifted again, yet the moral question raised by the Opium War remains unresolved. Where does commerce end and violence begin? At what point does trade cease to be exchange and become coercion? China emerged changed, scarred but determined. Its modern posture, defensive, assertive, deeply aware of history, cannot be understood without this story. The memory of forced trade and national humiliation still informs its relationship with the world. The war fought over a drug did not simply change China. It changed the rules of global power. It taught the world that profit could be defended by force, and that civilization itself could be bent to serve markets. And it left behind a warning, written not in treaties, but in suffering. History remembers this war not for its battles, but for its meaning. Because when trade demanded obedience and addiction became policy, the modern world was born. Not in harmony, but in imbalance that still has not healed.